So anyway, my name's Garrett, and it's really kind of a story about families. As you can tell, my daughter, my son, my wife is over there, my sister's over here. Everybody has worked on these horses in my family. And one of the things about being somebody who works with historic items is you don't want to throw anything out. And I also didn't want to throw or delete any of the pictures in this, which made it way too long. And I went through it just before and realized that I've got to be kind of quick on this. So I'll try and say as much as I can, but some slides I might go through kind of quickly. Anyway, these horses that are in the front are, and the point of this whole thing this year is we have done a second set of 20 horses. We've been working on them for like 20 years now, and this is the last of that set being completed. What they allow is the original horses to be on in June, and then these horses will be the set. They're just like the originals, but they're newer, and they haven't been used like pin cushions for 150 years, and they'll last longer. So this is kind of the beginning of a new thing for us, and the whole set will come off, and the new set will go on. And this is 2 of those that will be on in just a few weeks. So here we go. As I said, this is it's about family, and that's my dad, and my eldest son Dylan, and Beth, who's standing right over here. And as we go through these pictures, you're probably going to say, well, this is either a story about family or child labor, but here they've grown up, and you can see that's Dylan working on stirrups, Beth on the other side, and here's Ben playing in the sand, having a good time as the horses are being unloaded out of the family Volvo, and then 10 years later he's selling tickets in the ticket booth. And one of the things about this is it is about families. There are families, the Moores, the Richards, there's a lot of different families that have been involved in this for years, and whereas 30 years seems like a lot, when you start reading this stuff, you realize a lot of families have been involved in these for 30 years. And so here's Ben putting up, here, Ellen, my wife, has put up with me and the deadlines of these horses for, 33 years. Oh, sorry we can't go away, we've got, inspections, we've got this, we've got to get these done. Because you try your best just to have the horses ready on time for the inspections and be good for another 3 months every year. The other thing is this is sort of a kind of a reverse Dorian Gray thing. That is me 30 years ago. The horses stay the same and I get older. And what got me into this is actually Mystic Seaport was the beginning of all this. I loved art, and I got to work there and work in all the different places, the opportunities. You can work in a shipsman's shop, you can work in a carving shop, you can learn how to rebuild a boat. And, I worked on the Sabino for years. I used to shovel coal and answer bells for forward and reverse, and that's how I paid my college loan. But after having left there, I was still able to do house portraits at Christmas and paintings. And here we go, figureheads that went across the oceans. You can see one version in clay, and then eventually becoming aluminum, and then going off into the world. And I just like that part of this job. This job was one of my favorite. The father of American sculpture was a guy, William Rush. And William and John Rush's son did an eagle on the Schuylkill River. And what I like about this so much is if you literally, if you watched the movie Rocky and you saw Sylvester Stallone run up the steps in Philadelphia, and he went into the Museum of Fine Art and ran through the building and out the back door. That's the view he would get, as he would be looking at that eagle. So anyway, that was a bronze that we did. But all of this stuff kind of came together to make me a pretty good person at working on these horses. And brought me into the world of carousel horses. That's a copy I did of a larger density. That was the sort of thing you'd see in the 1880s. But once again, the Seaport, that's a figurehead. It's on the Amistad. And one of the neat things about this job is 20-something years ago when I made this and they were building the Amistad, I did the eagle. But in 20 years, it's been places. wore out, nobody painted it, nobody did things to it, and it came back to the house this winter, and just 6 weeks ago, Ellen also, and Bill, and everybody were involved in gold leafing, so we had to recarve it and repaint it, because it was in pretty rough shape. But it's back in the boat. That also happened with this figurehead. This is the Tea Party Museum figurehead that's up in Massachusetts. 12 years ago I finished it. Nobody looked at it. It's a museum. But this year it was the 250th anniversary, and they said, quick, please come. And so Ben and I commuted back and forth in traffic and got there repainted. But it's science is really what brought me here, and doing this sort of stuff. I learned to do those at the seaport. And here's a little cigar store figure. That's Ben in front of the cigar store. But it was the signage that actually is what got me there at the seaport. So the seaport got me to Watch Hill because they had a little bookstore in Watch Hill. And the little bookstore needed a sign, so I carved it. And while I was doing it, the neighboring store said that they'd like to have a sign too. And it was a fellow named Bob Richens. And Bob Richens is the guy who asked me to work on the carousel. So after I finished his sign, he said, boy, could you just come down the street and take a look at the forelegs of these horses that we have and put some paint on these horses. And that was the beginning of all this. And so here they are, they're the first 4 that came back to the house in the condition they were in when they came back. Now, so that's what got me there, but what got the horses to Watch Hill. And you guys, just the fact that you're probably the sort of people that like this sort of stuff, this history. Anyway, that's what the carousel looked like when it first came to Watch Hill. It showed up in like 1889. It was a fellow named Edward Hager brought it. He had worked in just on the other side of New Haven at a carousel at an amusement area before that, and then in Albany before that. So this carousel had already been in all sorts of places. And when it came here, you can see it's very similar, other than the fact that it's got a canvas top at this point, but it's still hanging horses, spinning around. It's probably horsepower at this point, because in the messages, that's in the writings it talks about how there was a calico horse that would pull the ride. And here's just another shot of it from a different angle. The bathhouses, the beach would be behind us, and that's looking down Bay Street. And this might, I like to think this was Edward Hager himself, or one of the people that followed. There was a fellow named Beebe who came, Gilbert Beebe, right after him, who also did 31 years taking care of the carousel and running it. There was a series of different people. There was another Anderson, Fred Anderson, who took over. He was 15 when he started running the carousel. Anyway, there's a whole series of people. But the point when Hager brought this carousel, there were lots of little kind of itinerant carousels that were crisscrossing the nation. And they would go from amusement parks to playgrounds to wherever. And this is a great example of a very similar carousel. Maybe it's a little simpler, but not much. If you look at those horses, they probably were just like the ones that were on the inside row of the Watch Hill Carousel. And if you look really carefully in the middle, you'll see that there's a guy on a crank who's hand cranking them. But you can see how somebody showing up in town with a carousel like this, people in town might say, boy, they were gypsies. So that's maybe where this story came from years ago, that gypsies brought the carousel to Watch Hill and left it behind. It was people who went from probably the warmth of New England in summer. The story, the things I've read, is he took it down to Texas in the winter. And so one of the things about Watch Hill, like I said, it had come from a kind of an amusement park. But one of the things is, Watch Hill was a great place. It was kind of an amusement park of its own. There were boats that you could sail or row, there were beaches, there were bands, and this little boat, the Ella, came from Norwich. It left at 8:15, and it could get you on Watch Hill by noon for lunch. And here's just another angle of Ella. Maybe it's because of 5 years on a steamboat. I have to show you pictures of steamboats or something. But there's Ella, and there's a bunch of the boats that were being let from at a dock right there. People could row or sail. They'd set the sails and get them all ready, and you'd rent them and go out and play in the harbor. So many people came that they had to build a bigger boat. And this is the Block Island. And the Block Island was built just with the idea that it wouldn't have as much trouble getting the Block Island roll as much as the Little Elm. But once again, it brought tons of people to Watch Hill. And it had its own dock. And that's the Watch Hill Light. So I don't know if you've ever gone out on the beach, but you can imagine looking at that dock and you can see the people coming off and getting onto the boat. It was pretty, down here is the dock walking up towards the Larkin House. You could have a room here for a week and enjoy Watch Hill and maybe go for a ride on a carousel. Now, this picture, there's a lot of little pictures, but if you look at them carefully, there's a woman right here in the weeds to the right-hand side, but if you follow the dark down the grasses and you go towards the hotel, there's a little road, and if you look at the little peak, there's a little peak of a tent in that picture, and that's the carousel. The Larkin House is behind it, so it means it's probably before like 1906. I think that's when that was torn down. So it's just another scene of Watch Hill. And of course, if you wanted to get there, one of the other things is, to get as many riders on a carousel as you can have, is to have a trolley come right to your front steps, and that was probably taken from the front steps of the carousel. Trolleys love to have a carousel at the end of their line too, because that way people would use their trolley on weekends, not just during the work week to get to work. And this, you might be wondering, why has this guy got a picture of, this is Fort Mansfield. This was at the very end. At the beginning of the century, they had a fort out there, and if any of you have walked out there and seen the ruins of that old fort, there's the gun emplacement. That's what it looked like, and I think it was dismantled in 1926 or something like that, because they realized it had a blind spot, wasn't really able to guard them very much. But Watch Hill was a great place to go, and that was my point. You could swim, you could enjoy it, you could listen to a band. That's the Watch Hill House, and if you didn't stay at a house, lots of people built houses along Tapestry, and those are the bath houses, and here's all the houses on Tapestry Beach, which is just sand still today. This is a picture from 1906. You can see there's the carousel has already at that point changed, and it's got a roof on it, it's got pillars around it, here's another shot of it showing with cars around it, and the houses in the background, about 1912 it says. Now, not everything was perfect in Watch Hill. They had the Great Fire, I think it was 1916, which destroyed that Watch Hill house that I just had a picture of, and a couple other places behind it. And I'm just pointing out that once again how lucky these little horses were, because they had to be stored somewhere. Larkin House had been torn down. Who knows where they were stored that winter? Half of Watch Hill burned, and somehow they made it through. They also made it through the hurricane of '38. All those houses you saw in that top picture are washed away in the second picture. 15 people were killed who were out on that point. They never built anything back there again. But it gives a pretty good idea of, once again, how lucky these horses were, because even though this is where the yacht club was, I don't know if you ever go down into the little parking lot, everything was destroyed from that point on, and the horses had to be dug out. I met one woman who told how her father had been brought over from Long Island to help dig out Watch Hill and the horses. Here's a picture of it, and if you look closely, you can see a couple people waiting for the next rider. But it was those stone stanchions and the wooden around it that protected it, and most everything just beyond that was washed away. Oh, okay, finally, restoration. This is what we're supposed to be talking about. I just so when these horses came, they needed a lot of work. As Bob Richards had said, they had wobbly legs. And you'll see in a minute, if you look closely, that eye in the top looks a little swollen too. And I tried to figure out how to make these things look like the original. I've been sort of brought in afterwards. There were a lot of people who'd been involved in it, but not me. And I've done a lot of maritime carving, but no horse carving like that, and painting. So being a journalist and major in college, I looked back at the newspapers, and sure enough, the Sun had some great pictures of horses through the years. And that's a 1938 picture of the horse, and it showed a little bit of the trappings and how they were. There was also stories about every year about the opening of the carousel. Maybe you see it today. It shows pictures of Ben and people loading, Rob Richards loading horses. This just talks about how it was painted yellow. Well, just the other day, Ted Mitchell, the guy who's running the carousel this year, said he was taking some wires off, and there was yellow paint all over underneath the wires. Well, this little article talks about how a new coat of fresh yellow paint was put on the carousel. And then sometimes you go down a crazy thing, and you finally found something about a carousel, and you realize it's a different carousel. Watch Hill had 2 carousels one year, and a Ferris wheel. The other was steam, though, and I guess it made a lot of noise, and the Calliope made a lot of noise, and in the end of the year, it was just a little horse-drawn carriage down the road left. That was 1896. And this is Gilbert Beebe, who I was talking about. You find an article, and it talks about how he took the carousel and took it from being horse-powered to water-powered. They would literally pump water up into a tank, and then run the water out of the tank, and that would run a turbine, which would make the carousel turn. Oh, and then, of course, there's maps. And here's something from 1895. It says, it shows a little circle. It just shows the little carousels already in the maps. But, and here, this woman on the right-hand side, or your left, sorry, was what Harriet Moore was one of the people who saw value in these horses when nobody else did. And due to her, really, in more ways than one, that carousel is still around. Because these were kind of shabby little horses. They had real manes, which were tough to take care of and hard to replace, and real leather that wears out, and just lots of coats of paint. Even at that point, they talk about that in these articles. But she kind of steadfastly worked hard at researching and figuring out where these horses might have come from, and making sure that they got paint and moved on. Here are some of the pictures of some of the guys she had working. This is Bill Street Jr. working on the horses in his backyard, getting tails ready. And what's nice about these pictures is it shows parts that he replaced, so I recognize this stuff when the paint comes off. I go, oh yeah, this is a Bill Street part. That looks a lot like our backyard. That's our basement these days. But and so what was interesting about this is it mentioned a guy named Frederick Freed. And I worked at Mystic Seaport, and they had an interpreter's library, which was full of books. And at lunch, what else to do but look at the books? And Frederick Freed was a folk arts kind of god. And somewhere else in these notes, it also said his phone number. And I thought, wow, can you call a god? So it turned out it wasn't even a toll call. And he was on the other end. He answered his own phone. He was a curator up at Shelburne for years. He was also a trustee at South Street Seaport. He was a great guy. And he kind of laid out in several phone calls that year kind of the guidelines that we went by for the next 10 years. Anyway, he said that we should check out Oak Bluff's Carousel. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been out to Martha's Vineyard and seen that. But this is actually, that might be the book I read. I don't know. But it was at the Seaport, and he did tons on folk arts. He kind of was one of the first people to write about appreciating folk art as the rules are. And this is the carousel out of Oak Bluffs. And you can see when you look at it, it's similar, but they're bigger horses, and they've got carved saddles, which means they're much easier to take care of. But they still have manes. But what they did have is these same eyes that are on the carousel horses here. And it's actually a very similar carving to the carving that you would have seen on our large horses, too. The eyes are very close. And this is what's on their website right now, which I find fascinating because, that earlier picture was what they looked like 30 years ago. And they had, 20 years ago, brought in somebody who was fairly famous to do the painting and take care of the horses and make them look good. And they look a lot like the paint jobs we've been doing here down in Watch Hill. And so imitation is supposed to be the greatest form of flattery. Well, I'm flattered. Okay, back to the little Watch Hill figure here. There was a woman who ran a bookstore, and she said, boy, you should come by and see my 1883 Dare carousel horse, because that was going to be our connection. The carousel said it was from 1883 and everything I read. And I went there and saw it and with my dad, and we looked at it and knew it didn't look anything like the horses we had in the garage. So maybe the ones in the garage were from an earlier time. But this was her carousel. You can see it's nearly everything's carved. The beauty of this was it didn't need as much maintenance. Without the leather, you don't have tacks. Without tacks, you don't have dirt and grime getting in, mold forming. These would last much longer than the little horses. Now, but she was a bookstore owner, so she had books, and she gave me books about carousel horses and rocking horses. And this, I don't know if anybody's from Westerly around here, but in this group, but Jesse Crandall, the guy who designed this in 1860 or 61, was from Westerly. And he became a big toy inventor in New York. And I thought, this must be it. The guy's from Watch Hill. It must be the right thing. And then I saw some horses, and I said, well, he invented something very much like it. He's from Westerly, but that's not quite the same horse. And then later in the book, there's more pictures, and it talks about different horses. This is by a guy named Andrew Christian. And when we looked up those horses, yeah, those horses did look a lot like the ones on Watch Hill. And they have these weirdly upraised forelegs, and that's so that they can spring up and down. Regular bow rockers at that time were killing people. People would get going on them and really get excited, and the thing would flip and they break their necks. Oh, wait, left. There was a slew of what they called safety rockers, and that was one. Here's another. You see how much that looks like one of these? That's out front. So I guess really what I'm saying is at this point we realized there was a connection between this guy and these horses. And he died in 1871, somewhere around there, maybe 1772. So we know that it probably had something to do with a horse that was before that. This actually is mine. I bring home things like this, Ellen, I'm sorry. Anyway, I get all excited because it has a little sticker on it, it says 1861, and it's a spring horse. And it's kind of the missing link between this. They made them in several different sizes. There was a small size, which had a 6-inch body, that's what that was, an 8-inch body, which is the smaller horse here, and a 10-inch, and a 12 and a 14. And you could buy, so there were lots of different people who made these, of that same basic stuff. This is Dare, who took over for Andrew Christian. And you can see he made different types of carts, and spring horses, and regular bow rockers. This is the guy who went into carousels. And sure enough, that one looks a lot like the one on Martha's Vineyard, and this looks a lot like the one that was eventually out of Watch Hill. But the horses still didn't look the same. And these are what the horses started looking like when we started taking the paint off. And so this probably had more in common with those horses than anything. This is actually the Central Park Carousel in about 1871. So that gives a pretty good idea it's the same horse. If you look at that funny little four-leg design, you can see that they're pointed up. And this was Prospect Park, not far from that, across the river, also down in New York. And this is a horse that Beth and I have been working on by a guy named Charles Carmel, Coney Island style. Horses were kind of like, in the car design world, we had to change our design every year to look cooler and neater, and the carousel horse industry did the same thing. We have to be flashier, we have to do something. And the little hobby horses like Watch Hills were being left behind. And that's the reason, even though there were probably hundreds of those made, and there aren't many of those, there's one now in Watch Hill. It's kind of like, if you have a Toyota Corolla, you get 300,000 miles, you take it to the dump. But if you have a Rolls Royce, well, maybe you're not going to take care of it. So there's more of these really fancy horses than there are of the little Watch Hill stock. I mean, so this is a good example. Savin Rock, I started to say how Hager, the guy who had the carousel, the carousel ran in Savin Rock for 10 years before it came up to Watch Hill. This was 1912 in Savin Rock, so it's a good thing Hager wasn't trying to compete with something like that. Of course, we're just about 5 miles away. in Musqueam Beach, the Atlantic Beach had its own carousel, and this was there before the storm in 1938, and then the one that they had after. And these horses were carved by Elliott. They were about as fancy a horse as you can imagine. So the competition was pretty stiff just around the corner. And I guess really what I was trying to get at is, what we realized in what we were trying to do was, they had made rocking horses and turned them into spring horses. And that's been it. and that became carousel horses. And there's a little progression. And okay, now I can see people getting tired, so I'm gonna move on this. But this is, once again, this is how the horses came. And if I seem to be doing a lot of pictures kind of quickly, it's because we did a run through and I went too long before. And rather than have you guys eating dinner at home when I'm finishing, we're gonna try and race through some of these. But you can see there's teeth, or we can't tell really what's there. There's a lot of coats. This is the way they came. There's all sorts of repairs. Just everything was done to get it through another summer, get a coat of paint on, and off it would go. Because each year the paint wore off the knees, and this is the hole where the rod goes through that the horse sits on, and kids are getting their fingers caught in the rods. This poor guy looks like he's got slugged because when the glass eyes were broken, these rare glass eyes that were made before 1900 in Germany, they couldn't find them here. Matter of fact, I had a terrible time finding them in the beginning. But this, they used straw poles. They used anything that was glass. Here's a broken eye. So what I did was I just turned them around because the backside was still good. And there it just shows that it was starting to come apart. Any place that was a joint that was covered with wood, the paint was coming off. And then there was this, when you pulled the leather away, there was this kind of slime behind the leather of fungi and algae, and wood to that sort of stuff, that's just food. So they were eating away. And just lots of paint. Everything was cracked. So you can see, now this was the real reason. You couldn't just paint them. Those cracks that you can see there, wood expands and contracts. Paint, as it gets really old, doesn't. And so as the wood would expand and contract, moisture, heat, the paint wouldn't, and you get these cracks, kind of like plate tectonics. If I painted that, those cracks would come through in a year. So the people of Watch Hill decided the thing to do to improve the society. The fire district said, go to it, let's tear these apart and make them like them. Or at least try to make them like them. And there's the paint coming off, and there's more paint coming off. And what's kind of cool here is these red eyes, and red nostrils, and everything there. The first 4 horses that I did, I actually did do some of those red eyes and red, and Mrs. Hall, a woman who was, Carol Hall, who was taking care of the horses that year, looked at it and said, those look like Darth Vader's horses. So I painted them up. I had to realize, oh yeah, people are used to these kind of cute little horses with 2 tight bridles. They don't want to have Darth Vader on their horse. And then that little carving that was underneath all that paint started showing up too, and more destruction. And that paint that was underneath, you can see somebody had painted little eyebrows and made it look very pretty. And teeth, I did the teeth, I had no idea. And of course, lots of repairs and questions. And when you got underneath, you realized, yeah, there were huge cracks. These repairs, those 2 spots were fascinating because somebody who had been doing work on those pieces that hold the roof in place, they had just used concrete to fill those holes. And you painted over the concrete and it looked fine for 30, 40 years, but it didn't seem like I was right to put that concrete. And this just shows everybody repairing everything needed a spike. There's a spike that goes through there. Once the leg was wobbly, they either added a bending plate or put another spike in. Just another example of all the cracks, all the nails. None of these were original. Those, you didn't realize in the paint that was actually 2 separate pieces of wood, so every time people put another spike in, they were actually separating the 2 pieces that were glued together. And this just showed that as things are coming back together, things are looking better. There is fresh wood underneath the rotten wood, and pieces are all fitting. There's more destruction. Oh, here I am opening up the box again. And what we have inside is old tickets, all sorts of debris, all sorts of stuff. And dead squirrels. So, you know, these things were kept in a little garage outside, and there were 2 holes. It was a great place for a squirrel flock to go, and like some Stephen King horror story, they died listening to carousel music. We buried. Then there's also little clues. Like, I was hoping, does this say somebody's name? And as much as I kind of turned it around my head, I didn't see it say a name. But there were, you know, little pencil markings as you tore things apart. I didn't tear all the horses apart, because tearing apart it's a tough thing to do a horse, but where they were coming apart already, it had to be fixed. And this just shows how, where the upholstery was done. Once the horse was carved, it went to an upholsterer. The upholsterer must have been really rough with the chisel. And somebody very delicately, I don't know who it was, one of the people who had the carousel, and they were taking care of it, realized that the knees were wearing off every year, and very delicately made little knees and tacked them back on. And then, you know, everything that, these big spikes had to get drilled out, and dowels had to get put back in. But there we go, that's the horses again. Oh, and one quick thing, that piece to the right, that little piece of body putty up there, was actually what's left of, there used to be scabbards on these and swords. And instead of grabbing the ring, you used to really, you know, get the ring with the sword. I guess insurance or somebody. Fill that. And just every time you put a tack in it, it leaves a hole. And, you know, not just front legs were broken, but back legs too. And there's the teeth coming back through, things coming back together, repairs. And this just shows how many repairs. There's 5 different cracks right in that little elbow. In here too. But once again, you can see there's a little key joint right there. And that key joint tells us that this horse was made to be a bull rocker first. This wasn't meant to be anything else. So this has got a pedigree. It was an old horse. Came before carousel horses. And there you can see them all getting ready for paint, and ta-da! The first coat of primer. And then doing the work on the eyes. And then this is what I thought I was seeing, a pattern that was a little like this as I was taking the paint off. It looked like squirrels. It's actually a little more like what you see on this horse in front of me. But as I was scraping the paint, it was scraping half the squirrels away, so I thought they were half me. Anyway, and here they are kind of coming together, doing the leather work, all the different, it seems like every time you got a stage done on one of these horses, oh, right, I got to do this too. There they are coming together, and then sewing, and then there are the eyes that have been turned around to show the good parts again, and the cracked sides are on the inside. And this is what the horses started looking like after the done. And my kids at the time really liked what I was working on as opposed to what Wheels did. Okay, real quick, paintings. Frederick Fried, right, who wrote the book, said, and the other thing is they didn't have plastic eagles and mirrors around carousels. So take those things off and do paintings. So I did paintings, kind of like he talked about. He said there were schlock artists. There were artists in New York City that would take whatever picture you had, and they would make it big, and you'd have something on your wall. And they would do very quick paintings. So I did these paintings one a day. These are copies of Winslow Homer, that's a Patty, it's a Wyeth, Remington, just things that would have been out there. It's hard to believe, but these horses are so old that kids could have ridden them and then gone off to work on whaling ships like the Charles W. Morgan afterwards. And yeah, wagons were still going west. Howard Pyle was a famous author. He illustrated his books, and they're just scenes like that, or beaches. And there we go. That's the carousel, the way it looked, with all the paintings around it, a lot like the other horses would have looked. And I would love to say, oh, and that was, 10 years ago, we didn't ever have to do anything again. It was all done. But every year they came back with more breaks and more cracks, because as many as 6,000 kids a week would ride on these horses. And some of them had real terrible breaks. And then in the spring, I go retrieve them out of wherever they were put, the ones that weren't worked on, and they had all sorts of decay that happened over the winter where they'd been stored. So there was always a little more work than they'd planned. The guy who took over Frederick Freed's job was a guy named Kirshner, Rick Kirshner, and he was fantastic. He came down and kind of looked at everything and said, boy, you have two alternatives with this, and you got to think about what you want to preserve. Do you want to preserve an open-air carousel, or you want to preserve the carousel itself and the animals itself? He said, if you build a building around this carousel, and you put air conditioners in it, and you climate control it, then the horses will probably last. Or you keep it open and you make another set. And the people in the Improvement Society and the people in the fire district who own the horses got together and said, boy, we want another set. So here, the first 10 or so, first 9, I was doing myself. But Beth and Ben got old enough and good enough at this stuff, stronger than me at times. But anyway, here's Beth pulling stuff through a planer, Ben pulling stuff through a planer, and getting boards ready to go together to become another horse. Really virtually like the ones with the key joints. And a key joint really, this is just an example of what a key joint does. It just makes the leg a little bit stronger. And then we built the boxes and then clamped everything. And you can see it's a lot of clamps. Way too many clamps. You hear Beth say, we have finished because you've used every clamp in the place. We're done here. I can't even tell what it was we're working on. You can't see clamps. And these are the heads in the middle of all of that. But little by little, they all come together and they look like square versions of themselves. And so, since carousel horses aren't square, the next part was carving them down to shape. And little by little, carving and sanding until we got something that had the teeth and looked pretty close to what the originals. Now, if it seems like a lot of pictures, that's because there's a lot of horses. So we're doing this a lot. And you can see they've got eyes now, and the ears are going in, and little by little everything's coming to shape. You can see the way they were carved and shaped to cut 3 segments. And the eyes are there now. And this brings me to my next speaker. My daughter has been helping because with all these horses, there's now 40 of them. You gotta get trim, you gotta get colors that match, and you gotta think about which horses are on the carousel and which ones weren't, because you're blending them. And one of the things we had to do was find eyes. That was always difficult. And Beth was the person who did all this. So that's fun.
So what we're looking at right here are the antique German sulfide marbles made in the 1910s, and they are incredibly hard to find. So while Dad is carving and sanding and painting and sanding again and more paint, and I look for eyes. So this is what we got, and here they come together, and look, our horses are just alive, and it really brings them all together. So I really enjoy this part of it. And again, these are replicas, so we try to make them as close as they would have, but we're, using new materials, of course. So the first coat of paint really is a base coat in color, and then you build up those details like Dad was talking about, the circles and the dapples that they used to use. And we try to, various pictures here, we modeled them after real horse breeds. So I don't know if there are real horse people here, but I do a little research and I say, oh, this one's pretty. It's a painted pony, it's a roan, it's a buckskin, we do all that kind of stuff. So here they are, and the last layer of paint is actually at least two coats of varnish, and that really just holds all that paint, seals it in, and also protects it from the elements. They're outside all summer, getting wind and sand, and so that helps that too. But they also, the varnish antiques things. The white's yellow, the gray's green. They just look a little bit more like what they would have. And then we start building the saddle, and you really kind of think of it as layers, building blocks. First comes the canvas. As you can see, everybody gets one. We paint them different colors. I really have been, the last couple of years, trying to make every horse different, and that makes the kids enjoy them. Sometimes they pick a favorite. Oh, my favorite's Thunder, my favorite's whatever, you know. So every year it changes, and that's fun. The little copper tacks that you can see here is what we hold every layer with. It does less damage than the big nails that you saw earlier in the archive photos. We're trying to prevent all that rust. So here we are. Oh, and then Dad is cutting leather. We do it all ourselves by hand. This tool helps you get the right width. A wider width gets the, as you can see up here, the shoulder straps. A little bit smaller and you get the stirrups. Smaller again, you get the reins. So it's all a process there. But we also pound the pattern out with carving tools. And again, we try to vary it up so everybody has something unique. And there it is, looking shoulder straps, chest, belly, coming together. The next thing we do is the bridle. So that means a lot of headgear, you know, they went to the orthodontist. They get the bit with the brass rings, the nose strap, the head strap, all of that comes down to a martingale at the chest, and they really start to look dressed, I guess. We do the reins and the stirrups, all of these things hand sewn just like they would have been 150 years ago. They are also really important strength-wise, because in case a kid is bouncing all over the place and starts to fall, they gotta be able to grab on something. So we like to keep things sturdy. This is them coming together still. We do, again, lots of details. So there's paint on the shoulder straps, different designs. This is another layer of gimp, and the gimp goes on the front, the fringe on the back next to the blanket, more color, more just something to make them stand apart. This also is the martingale. It holds the reins to the chest. We like to rope the horses down. This is the saddle, the very last layer of leather. It's got lots of cushions under there. We soak it, condition it, make it really workable, and then we strap it down to form it into the shape of the saddle. So that's how we get these to look so good. Here we go again, and then we also got some pictures of more detail on the blanket. We did the little swirl that they used to have, so we're really just trying to do what they did. The other thing on everything is tacks, lots and lots of brass tacks, and it's a detail, but it's also fun because in the 1800s they used furniture upholstery tacks, so do we, and we buy them by the bucket. My dad then, this is the geeky part, I don't love this part. So a really cool thing about the horses is that they are real horse manes. It's very unique, not, you know, Dad was saying, everybody else carved the manes, made them flowing in the wind. But we use the real thing. And in order to do that, you have to soften the hide and then sew the hide into a shape that you can use as a mane or a tail. And that is something that we do by hand. So it takes a lot of pieces, a lot of working with the manes. And then finally, they look all nice and ready to go. I also brush the hair, I condition the hair, we use real hair products like L'Oreal, because it makes them shiny, and that is fun for me. So, as you can probably see, we've been working in the same workspace where we also store them. We have learned a lot about antique usable art and how to prolong its life. So relative humidity is a huge thing. We have not weather, but we have sensors all over our workspace, dehumidifiers, humidifiers. We try to keep track and maintain that perfect space so that we don't get that mold or cracks or things like that. And so they are looking pretty good. And now we're going to turn it over to Ben, who's going to talk about installation and the carousel itself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ben, as you learned multiple times, and all of my pictures growing up throughout my childhood in this presentation. But what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is the installation process, the transportation process that's required kind of before those steps, as well as the structure of the carousel itself, and any kind of winterized maintenance that we do every season. What you see right here is Beth untying a horse out of the back of our truck. We use our own vehicles to transport the horses from our workshop to the carousel in Watch Hill. And we've kind of perfected the art of using furniture blankets as a cushioning layer. We try to pack the horses like sardines in a can into all of our cars and our truck. There's actually 3 different stages of transportation throughout the season. So you have the May installation, which is the very first one of the season. It's mainly one day, work the whole day, and it's a similar thing to when we take it down in September. It's the whole process all at once. The thing that stands out is the middle of the summer, where we do the swap between antiques and the replicas. Because it's during operating hours and like 6,000 kids a week, we actually work during morning hours from about 7:30 to 9 before the carousel opens. And because we only have that limited window, we work before the carousel opens. These are just, this is an old picture of Dad transporting before we joined his team a long time ago. That's an old truck, old cars. We don't have those anymore. But this is almost exactly what we do over and over again. We have Volvo wagons, lots of storage space. It's about 4 horses per car and 6 horses in the truck. Once we arrive, we take all those furniture blankets, we use them as the cushion layer again on the floor. We lay out the horses, and the special thing about this photo is that, as you can see, most of the horses are laying on their side. As you saw from most of my dad's photos, those legs, especially on the antiques, are made of multiple pieces, and so if you place them on all 4s, there's a bit of a risk of them supporting that weight. So if they lie on their side, there's no trouble in them possibly falling over and hurting themselves. We don't have to worry about that. This also gives us an opportunity to attach the hardware to the horses that is used to hang from the carousel. There's a metal rod that sticks from the bottom up to the top between the mane and the saddle. And there's also a wooden metal plate, a wooden washer, and then what I'm working on in this photo is the 2 nuts that sit at the bottom that are actually tightened against each other. Now there's a couple of extra steps there for safety reasons. There's a cotter pin down at the bottom, and then when it gets attached, there's actually an aircraft tie that loops between all of the eye holes in the metal up above. And that is, safety inspections have just increased over the last 150 years. We don't have 15-year-olds running the carousel anymore. And so that ties in with a couple things later. The next step is paintings installation. And there are 15 small paintings. There are 13 of the big paintings. And the big paintings are actually stationary. They sit on the walls of the engine room. But the 15 up top, they're slightly smaller. They sit on the spars, and they actually move during the ride. We have to thank Robbie Richens. Every single season he shows up. He's in the audience back there. But he shows up with his crew. They are usually doing the painting process as we're setting up the horses on the ground. And then they join us for attaching the horses as well. What he and my dad are doing right now are setting up the chains. The chains are a secondary attachment point for the horses to the carousel. It's actually quite important because, as you can see, that horse in that photo is just hanging from the pole. It's quite dangerously low to the ground, and the chain allows it to swing back, attach up a little bit higher so it's up out of the way, and once the ride gets going, it's the function that allows it to swing out due to the force that's applied, and that's what makes it the flying horses of Watch Hill. These attachment points, as you can see, what I'm making, what my dad is making in the other photo, is these the metal spikes, and that's what they look like outside the horse. They get attached just in between the back legs, underneath the tail, and they run up to the secondary spar, the one behind the one with the metal pole. This photo is a little bit of a guilt for me because you're not supposed to handle one horse by yourself. These are antiques. These are especially important pieces of art, and we highly encourage that only that 2 people carry a horse for every leg. Don't do what I'm doing in this photo. But once they're all hung up, they absolutely look gorgeous. With paintings, with all the work that we put in. This was a horse that had its very first season with this photo. It's brand new leather, it's brand new paint, brand new hair. And this photo is important because we tried our best to work with what we had during 2020, during COVID. And we were mighty happily surprised that when we were all finished, the crew of the carousel came out and applied masks to all of our horses. And they actually set up a system where it was every other horse would be the one that would be ridden. And so that was their way of social distancing. And the last step for these horses is these canvas coats. It's a recent addition in the last 10 years. And there are ones that go on the big ones and the small ones. They're fit to size. What they do is they are applied when the carousel is not in use. When it closes down for the night, it's almost like a nice little coat to wrap them up in. It's to make sure that nothing damaging could possibly happen. This is an outside carousel. There are no walls. And so things like birds come in and steal our precious horsehair and use it to make their nests. This is just a shot of the carousel, of the real structure that's going on. It doesn't have any horses, or paintings, or any of the extremities added on. And we're going to talk about a bit of a breakdown next. So you may have been given a diagram of this. If not, you can come up and grab one later. But just to run through a couple of the key points, there is the horses are attached to that metal bar on the far right-hand side, exactly what I was talking about. Towards the bottom, you can see the wood washer, the cotter pin. That top hook of that bar gets attached to the lower eye hook on the sweep section. And there you can see a set of chains running out in front of it. So we usually group the horses in a group of 4. So it's on one spar, there's 2 horses. On one spar, there's 2 horses. And then there's a space of one spar in between. And that just kind of spaces things out. It was the way it's always been done. Another section to look at is those spars are held up by the metal cables all the way at the very top. They run to the metal pole that goes from the top to the bottom, which of course is where you see the engine, that giant turntable connected to the motor. One last thing that I want you to look at is these rounding boards, which is the wood paneling that sits on the very outside of the sweeps. It's connected to the metal bars that run between the spars, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that later. These metal rods that run through the horses, for a while there when I worked at the carousel, they were made of wrought iron. And so that meant that no matter how much care we put into them and maintenance, they would rust over the season. We would sand it down, we would paint it, it would rust again. This is a recent addition. They're now stainless steel, and they look really good next to a finished horse, nice and shiny. This is an example of the kind of damage that we might see, just because this was a carousel that was, 1880s, 1800s. And over time, the spars, which are made of wood, they have metal pieces that run through them. The metal rusts, the wood expands and contracts over the seasons and the weathers. The paint on the outside flakes, and some things crack and break due to the weight. I'm going to show you some photos of it later, why. But again, the roof was another repair job that we had to fix. The carousel showing its age. Again, this is tied to it. These are the metal, the wooden beams that support the roof. This is about 20 feet in the air or so, a little bit higher. You can actually see the top of that diagram that I was talking about, where it was the very top of the metal pole, which held all the wires, is the bottommost part of this image. So Beth and Dad are way up above that, gluing some damage back together. This is the most important part of all of this. It's what makes the carousel run. What Dad is doing right now is he's working on the clutch wheel, which is a part of this, which is the most important, I would say is the most important part. But what we do daily is, not daily, what we do every time we show up to do maintenance is greasing. Greasing allows the carousel to run smoothly, and it connects to the metal turntable, but the metal turntable is run by this clutch wheel. The clutch wheel is replaced seasonally. We work with a group up in Warwick, Rhode Island, so we try to do it locally. And you can see why it's replaced seasonally in the next slide, is because that metal table actually shreds the clutch wheel as it's in use throughout the summer. And so that's why it needs to be constantly replaced. This is just a view of the other side. That motor, that white motor on the far right, turns itself, which runs the rubber bands, which turns the wheel, which turns the clutch wheel, which turns the turntable, which turns the metal pole and turns the carousel. It is pretty impressive. This is another thing, just the rounding boards. It's starting to rust due to its connection point with those metal brackets. It was something we had to fix, sand down, and paint again. The rounding boards themselves, those wooden panels, also needed to be fixed with some rod and repainted, and there's Bethany attaching them. This is tremendously important. These are the steel cables, and this has since been fixed, but this ties into those safety inspections that I was talking about. And these are the things that hold up the weight, but they also need to be cleaned a lot of the time. So this is Bethy power washing at close range those metal cables. I'm not sure you can quite see it from a distance, but on this image particularly, the one that is behind the one that she's working on has been cleaned. It is nice and shiny, and the ones behind her are actually still dirty, and you can see some of the debris that is seeped into the metal cables there. This is a brand new cable connection for the 2 rings of outside cables. It was an update to a previous version of it. These are the 2 men from Trawlworks who are engineer advisors for us on how to hold up the weight from these spars. They actually told us to add another tertiary ring of these cables on the inside as well. And you will see why, because that was happening. So these cables hold the weight of the horses, they hold the weight of the kids, and the spars were starting to bend and warp over time. So this 3rd ring on the inside of these cables have straightened the spars out and fixed that. This is where they all lead into. It looks like a giant spider web of mechanical mass, trust me, I know. But as long as there's maintenance applied, regular maintenance, it works out all right and runs smoothly. There's Bethy applying that regular maintenance. And this all leads to a carousel that is colorful and is wonderful and is a real piece of history and something that we care for deeply. This is the end of our talk, but this is a bunch of photos of us and people that we love over the years working on this with us. And we'd love to, thanks to everyone involved. If you're not on the list, thank you especially to the Watch Hill Fire District, Watch Hill Improvement Society. Thank you to our close friends and family, and thank you to the Laguna Center for hosting us on this talk.